Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto and Sasuke became friends at a young age. Will Naruto's paranoia and mental instability draw Sasuke down into madness, or will Sasuke's own demons bring them both into the dark? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 1. The Ghost and the Darkness. He was loath to admit that every moment spent in Naruto's apartment was always a trial, the dreary silence, the cleanser-like atmosphere. But worse, the despair and misery that clogged the lungs and coated the tongue. He was always grateful to leave, but the despair always seemed to ruin the rest of the day and kept him from sleeping. Sarutobi grunted and berated himself for hesitating. Lifting a wrinkled hand, he knocked on the door, grimacing at how it echoed throughout the empty hall. No one lived on this floor, not since the attack of the nine-tailed fox demon. Only one person lived here, and yet all signs pointed to vacancy. When no one answered the door, which he never did for more valid reasons, Sarutobi sighed and let himself in with his copy of the key, bracing himself for another depressing session with Yondaime's fading legacy. The apartment was spotless, as usual, since the child went over every surface daily with a mechanical fervor that always made him uneasy. He bypassed the living room altogether and headed for the bedroom, Naruto's dwelling. His eyes fell briefly on the heavy curtains that covered the window, catching a glimpse of the newspaper glued to the glass. The uneasiness increased. The newspaper hadn't been there last week. Naruto? He called gently before opening the bedroom door. The door quickly met resistance and something tumbled with the sound of paper. Books. Sarutobi squeezed through the door, knowing he would not receive any help. Besides, the room seemed almost unoccupied but for the books that lined the walls in neat orderly piles, perhaps sorted by title or author. Most of the books he had given to him when he found that he enjoyed no Naruto did not enjoy things. His eyes fell on the wrinkle-free bed and uncluttered dressers. The heavily draped window also sported newspaper. A sniff attracted his attention. Naruto was crouched in a corner, pale and sickly, red-rimmed eyes and bony body. He was crouched over a manual, adorned in his favorite overlarge sweater and dark gray pants. The hood to the sweater was pulled up, covering the child's pale lanky yellow hair. Pale eyelashes framed dull blue eyes, glassy and often filled with tears. Whether he was aware of Sarutobi's presence would have been questionable, but Uzumaki always did his best to ignore the aging Hokage. "Hello Naruto," he greeted, trying to draw the child out of his cocoon. The 7-year-old glanced up at him, then back down at the manual. He had stopped reading fiction altogether since all the happy ever-afters made him cry. The Hokage searched the page for a title and found one at the top. How to problem-solve quantum mechanics. Whether Naruto understood what he was reading was curious, but he was never one to converse with others and had many phobias for that. "Naruto?" he asked politely. "Why is there newspaper pages pasted to your windows?" Uzumaki's eyes flickered to the window briefly before the broken voice whispered, "To keep them from watching." His shoulders hunched and tears filled his dull eyes. "They're always watching." Sarutobi swallowed and slumped down on the bed. Was Naruto now showing signs of paranoid schizophrenia, or were the villagers actually spying on him? Uzumaki Naruto was living a life Sarutobi would have killed to improve. Not once had he seen the youth smile, or show anything remotely close to joy or happiness. When Naruto had been an infant, his caretakers rarely touched him or showed affection. Naruto did not understand those things, and as a result, did not like to be touched. By the time he could walk, he was mostly left alone, and had begun to venture out in the village. This quickly stopped when several angry villagers had beaten him. Naruto was a quick learner, and stopped coming out of his apartment during the day. He was quick to discover that people traveled less during the night and were often too busy to stare or wonder at a small boy. He had even started wearing the large gray sweater with the overbearing hood to hide his features. But there was only so much of Konoha to ogle, and when Naruto had discovered all the nooks and crannies of the village, he ventured out less and less. Once, out of pure curiosity, Sarutobi had sent a small monkey to catalog a day in the life of Uzumaki, and after hearing its contents, had decided that once a week, on a Sunday, he would spend time with Naruto. Naruto's day did not start by waking up in the morning, because apparently Naruto did not sleep at night. But around 7 in the morning, Naruto would dig out cleaning supplies from under the kitchen sink and proceed to wipe down every surface in the apartment, starting with the counters and ending with the floors. The monkey had been adamant about every surface, including the walls and ceiling. This, the monkey claimed, proceeded for 5 hours straight with no stops for drinks or even bathroom breaks. The almost absolute silence of the ordeal had almost driven the monkey mad. It had complained about Naruto's mechanical strokes as he scrubbed the same spot on the kitchen floor, eyes said to be vacant. The whole ordeal smelled of some kind of obsessive-compulsive disorder, and it solved the mystery as to why Naruto's apartment made him feel like he was intruding upon perfection. Next, the monkey claimed, Naruto would crouch in the shower for an hour and let the water beat upon his pale skin. The monkey claimed there was very little movement involved. The rest of the day was spent reading. At night, the boy would leave the apartment and slink along the quiet streets. Sometimes, the monkey said, he would cry and wander, others he would crouch behind dumpsters and watch people hurry by. He would do this for a few hours before slinking back home and rock in a corner, cry, or stare off into space. Oh, and occasionally, as if to spice things up, he would have moments where he would fall asleep only to jolt awake as if someone had sent several bolts of electricity through him. This would happen off and on throughout the night. After 3 days of watching, the monkey had claimed that to preserve his own sanity, he had fled. So when had Naruto eaten? He had asked, and the monkey had seemed thoughtful before stating that not once had he seen the boy eat. He then told him how skeletal the boy's body was. "Have you eaten today?" Sarutobi asked, wondering if Naruto would reply. He provided Naruto with enough funds to live comfortably, but on further investigation found that most of it was usually spent on bleach and detergent. "Yes, Hokage," Naruto said in his deadpan voice, and produced a candy bar wrapper from his pocket. He did not look at the Sandaime, who shook his head in chagrin. "That's not enough for a growing boy, Naruto. You need to eat 3 square meals for a healthy diet." Naruto lifted his gaze and leveled it on the old man. His skin was sickly due to the lack of proper nutrients, his hair hung limp and lifeless, so much unlike his father's. Eyes were puffy and red-rimmed due to tears and insomnia. And of course, he looked like the poster child to one of those help feed our children ads. No, Naruto was not enjoying life, and if he didn't find something to interest the boy, he feared. Well, he wasn't sure what it was that he feared, but he knew that at least for once, he would like to see something other than despair or lifelessness in the boy's eyes. It was too sad, too unnatural. The eyes were still on him, perhaps waiting for him to say more, so he said what he usually said. "Why don't we go out and get something to eat?" It almost seemed routine to ask, and he waited for the usual cryptic reply. "No, they will probably poison me," and then he would stare at the walls or in this case, return to the book. Sarutobi was doing his best not to institutionalize Naruto, and hadn't yet gotten to the point where he had to threaten the child with it, but he realized he had just hit that point. Naruto's health was deteriorating and he would not stand by and allow him to do these things to himself. "You're leaving me with very little choices, my boy," he muttered, but Naruto seemed to have forgotten his presence again. Sarutobi sat for a time before sighing and getting to his feet. He pulled out a small packaged sandwich and stood before the crouching child who continued to ignore him. Crouching down before him, Sarutobi closed the book and placed the sandwich on top of it. He then took hold of Naruto's bony face, inwardly grimacing at how cold the flesh was. He knew Naruto hated to be touched, but he had an annoying habit of ignoring the pink elephant in the room, and this was the only way for him to catch Naruto's undivided attention. "Listen to me, Naruto," he whispered and watched as the dull blue eyes drilled into his own. "I want you to eat this sandwich." He picked it up and held it in sight. "And I want you to eat all of it. Look at the sandwich, Naruto," he said in his most authoritative voice when Naruto only stared at him. The blue eyes flickered over to the sandwich but returned to his own. He hated using this voice on children, but it was the only one Naruto paid attention to. "I want you to start eating more. If you don't, I'm going to have to take measures you won't like. Do you understand?" Naruto's eyes became glassy with unshed tears and Sarutobi's heart broke as they fell down the whiskered cheeks and on his fingers. How he hated threatening Naruto, especially when the child took all threats seriously, thanks to the potentially homicidal villagers. "Don't cry," Sarutobi whispered and wiped the boy's cheeks with his fingers. "I don't want to make you," said Naruto. "I just want you to be happy and well." He put the sandwich in Naruto's small bony hands and stood up. "I'll be back next week, okay?" Naruto's eyes had dropped to the sandwich that sat in his hands and made no reply. The Sandime sighed and left the apartment with the taste of cleanser coating the back of his tongue. It was 3 am, when Naruto dared to venture out of his apartment. Lately Konoha had been on edge for the last 2 months or so. It had something to do with the massacre of a clan. Naruto didn't read the papers, he only used them to cover his windows. There was laughter in his head, multi-voiced, some loud and deep, some breathy and feminine, and Naruto gave a bewildered start, flinching, eyes darting around. He didn't know what was so funny, but then, they laughed all the time. It wasn't nice laughter though, he wasn't sure if they were capable of niceness. Naruto weaved in and out of the shadows, eyes darting at the apartments and shops that lined the streets. At any moment, he could be attacked by one of the villagers. Naruto rubbed his puffy eyes and headed for the park. It was his favorite place outside of his apartment, but only in the wee hours of the morning, for no one would be there. Naruto headed for one of the swings and sat down, his body feeling leaden. Making sure his head was down and hood covering most of his face, he allowed the swing to move. Sasuke sat in the embrace of his blankets, body trembling in the silence. He would never get used to the deadness of the compound. Pained black eyes darted to the clock and saw that it was 2:45. He pulled the blankets over his head and shut his eyes tightly until they hurt. The images of his family, mother, father, cousins, aunt, and uncles, all lying motionless on the ground kept running through his head. And him with his cold eyes, him with that frozen face. Sasuke choked on the memory, throwing off his blankets and jumping off the bed. He couldn't stand to be here anymore. Pulling off his pajamas, he donned a blue shirt and black pants, putting on his blue sandals. He ran from the compound, the silence that seemed never-ending, and into the streets of Konoha. He glanced about as he strolled, eyes falling on the occasional villager rushing home, or some older kid sneaking a cigarette. If they had a home and went, would their parents be waiting up for them? Sasuke blinked rapidly and hurried along until he came to the village park and decided to enter. He passed the jungle gym bars and hovered near the sandbox, swooshing the sand with his foot, sniffing and telling himself it was because of the cold. Shinobi, or at least shinobi to be, did not cry. Sasuke glanced up and noticed a small figure sitting on one of the swings. Sasuke squinted, trying to see in the dark, but all he could see was what looked like a white or gray hoodie. Vaguely curious, and wanting to take his mind off of dark matters, Sasuke moved from the sandbox and approached the unoccupied swing next to the kid. He saw the body stiffen, but the kid kept his or her head down, shoulders hunched as if against a cold wind. Sasuke sat down on the swing, but did not move, instead focusing on the Hokage monument. It wasn't near cold yet, it being near the end of September. This was near the time his father liked to sit out on the wide porch and smoke his pipe, and his mother would sip tea in her delicate cups. Was it his fault? Was it something he did that made his brother kill everyone except him? Did he get on his nerves or ask too much of him? Was that why his family had been taken away? There was a whimpering sound, and his eyes blurred. Sasuke rubbed the tears away and sent an embarrassed sidelong glance at his silent neighbor, only to move on to a stare. The other kid looked sick, like he should be in a hospital bed or something, and not outside exposed to the elements. Sasuke turned his eyes away and stared down at the wood chips on the ground. Even when he tried not to think, images of their bodies assaulted his mind, and the knowledge that he would never see them again. Ever. Sasuke dropped his head in his hands and gave in to despair, sobbing as silently as he could, hot bitter tears leaking past his pale fists. He sat against the warm wind and let it run over his body, not caring that the other kid was there. Nothing mattered. But he knew without a doubt, that he wasn't going to return to the compound. He couldn't return there and not go crazy. He would sleep on the streets if he had to. He managed to stop weeping, though the tears still came, and once again glanced at his silent and hopefully oblivious neighbor. Once again he was left staring. The other boy was crying as well, face twisted in a grimace of pain, tears streaking down shadowed cheeks. What was he crying for? Was he hurt, had escaped from a hospital only to realize his wounds were too much? Or was he crying because he was? He'd seen plenty of toddlers do that. You okay? Sasuke whispered roughly, voice cracking. The other kid flinched and opened dripping blue eyes at him. There was so much pain in that one look. And fear. Lots of it. Sasuke wiped his face with his hands and looked away from the kid, instead staring at the stars, sniffing all the while. "Do know what I'm going to do?" he whispered to himself. "Can't go back there. I can't." God, he was so weak. Maybe Itachi hadn't killed him because he was so pathetic. So pathetic. They were urging him to take the black-haired boy home, something that was so out of the question, that he never bothered answering them. The boy already frightened him in the way most villagers do. They made his skin crawl, and he was afraid that the kid was going to beat him up. But he hadn't. He'd just looked at him, and started crying. At first, he had thought that it was because he found his face grotesque, but the weeping had a quality he could understand. Despair and defeat. They had jumped on this, whispering to him, insinuating on what a good friend he would make, but he ignored them. The villagers were never to be his friends, they were his tormentors, driving him to a slow grave. They would kill him, he was sure of this, for he had caught them watching him through his windows. Mind you, he couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. They were waiting for a moment's weakness. Perhaps this boy was sent here as a ploy, to get him. But he knew that was a lie even as he thought it. Emotion like that was too hard to fabricate, especially in a young kid like himself. They were so eager, he was sure plans were running through their heads. A headache spawned, the kind that hurt his ears, his teeth, made his eyes feel like they were going to pop out, and he too was crying because he knew they wouldn't let up unless he did as they commanded. Let someone into his only sanctuary. The Hokage was already out to get him, and now he was being forced into allowing a villager into his place. It was almost intolerable. He would have to clean everything extra hard now. He must have been there with the other kid for a few hours, because he began to see a few early morning joggers move through the park. At this, the kid who hadn't said a word or moved stood up from the swing and began to leave. "Where are you going?" Sasuke called after him, cringing out how pathetic he sounded and wishing at the same moment that he could wink out of existence. The boy froze and darted frightened eyes at him, to the joggers, to the brightening sky, then back to him. Straw-colored hair slipped from the hood and hung over an eye. "Am going home," came the raspy reply. Sasuke stared at him, wondering what his home was like, if his parents were frantic with worry that he had escaped the hospital and were now running about the village calling out his name. "Do you want to come with me?" The boy's voice came again, shocking Sasuke out of his thoughts. Sasuke stared at him in disbelief, taking in his wide, frightened eyes, as if waiting for Sasuke to slap him or something. Maybe he was afraid of how mad his parents were going to be when he showed up at home, so he wanted another kid there to temper their rage? That made sense. Sasuke shrugged as nonchalantly as he could manage and got up from the swing, then blinked in startlement as the kid began to quickly leave the park, at a pace that seemed almost close to running, his eyes darting about at the surroundings. Sasuke frowned but followed, then not liking walking behind someone, walked at his side. The other kid didn't seem to notice at first, preoccupied with shooting frightened glances at the few early birds that rose with the sun. The boy pulled the hood lower until it touched his lashes and bowed his head, and it came to Sasuke's understanding that this kid was scared of the villagers. They kept on this way until the kid turned towards an unkempt apartment complex and came to a door marked 057. The key was placed in the lock and the boy quickly slipped inside. Sasuke prepared to go, annoyed that the strange kid didn't at least say thank you, when he noticed that the door was still open, and the kid was staring at him with his large dull blue eyes. It was very creepy, because there was only darkness behind him, with only parts of him peering at him, like a ghost from one of those scary stories. Sasuke stared back. The blonde kid's eyes darted about the walkway before falling on him. "Aren't you going to come in?" The voice was a ghost of a whisper. Sasuke's brow rose. "Won't your parents be mad?" The kid blinked at him rapidly, as if the question had blindsided him before a reply came. "I don't have parents." "What a coincidence." You live alone?" Sasuke asked in disbelief and the blonde kid nodded, and opened the door about an inch wider, and clearly expected Sasuke to slip through there. For a second Sasuke hesitated, then he slipped through the door, the blonde moving behind the door, and entered the dark apartment as the door closed and locked behind him. A blast of cleanser hit his nose, and he was reminded of his kitchen when his mom used to have one of her psychotic cleaning moments, and he wondered if this kid had just moved in, because the place was spotless. It was so clean, Sasuke felt like he should hose himself down, outside, before stepping in here. The kid moved around him, throwing furtive glances at him over his hunched shoulders before walking into a hallway across from the living room and opened a door. He slipped through it as well and shut the door. And that was that. Sasuke stood in front of the door, staring at his spotless surroundings, the black couch on the spotless white carpet, the black drapes that covered the newspapered windows. The what? Sasuke took off his sandals and placed them by the other kid's shoes, and moved across the soft carpet to the windows, moving the curtains aside to stare at the window. Yep. Yesterday's newspaper. Sasuke blinked several times, and then eyed the rest of the apartment nervously. Besides the couch, there was a black cabinet, and a small table that held a porcelain white lamp. That was it. The kitchen was the same, everything done in a spotless black and white. Sasuke ran a hand over the surface of the stove, not a lick of dust. Not even his mother had been this good. The cleanser smell was giving him a headache too. He rubbed his eyes and they felt swollen, no doubt from his shameful tears and pure exhaustion. There was a small creak behind him. Sasuke spun around, startling the blonde kid, who jumped back and pulled the hood down over his face in pure reflex. Sasuke opened his mouth, not sure what to say to the jumpy kid, and decided to simply wait and see what the other boy would do. He watched as the kid smoothed the hood down over his head in a nervous gesture, thin fingers running over the fabric in what must be a comforting gesture. The boy darted nervous eyes at him. I thought you might be tired. So I made up my bed for you. Sasuke felt a wave of pain hit him, remembering that his mother used to make his bed for him, and he turned his head away, blinking away the tears. So weak. That's okay, he replied gruffly. I'll sleep on the couch. He looked back at the blonde kid, just in time to catch the wave of terror that washed over the kid's face, making his skin turn a ghostly white. The kid had to swallow several times before speaking again. It's not safe out here, he whispered, eyes darting to the windows. It's safer in there. The boy moved quickly through the living room, and Sasuke followed, almost feeling scared now. The boy slipped through the door and waited for him to slip through as well before shutting it. Sasuke stared around at the room. Unlike the living room and kitchen, this room was full with books that lined the walls in neat piles, leaving an open space to a bed fluffed up with a thick black comforter and white pillows. Just seeing the bed made his shoulders sag, but he turned to stare at the blonde. Where are you going to sleep? The strange kid turned and stepped over to a corner surrounded by books, and in the middle was a small blanket and pillow. The kid sat down on the pillow and wrapped the blanket around his thin shoulders, which weren't that well hidden beneath the sweater. He sent nervous glances his way before picking up a nameless flimsy paperback and giving it his undivided attention. Sasuke shrugged and slipped under the comforter, wishing he had his pajamas, and deciding he would get them later on today. Wait, what? He made it sound like he planned on staying here. He glanced at the other kid and saw that it seemed like the other had forgotten him completely. My name is Sasuke. Uchiha Sasuke. The blonde jumped in startlement and turned wide eyes on him. Had the kid actually forgotten him? He watched as he pulled the hood down over his face and smoothing it in a way that promised to be very annoying very soon before replying hesitantly. Uzumaki Naruto. Chapter 2. He felt a stick poking his arm. Sasuke swatted the stick away and turned into the thick covers. The stick poked his arm again, and Sasuke's eyes snapped open. He turned and blinked blearily at the blonde kid, then sat up, rubbing his eyes, feeling surprised that he had gotten a full night's sleep without nightmares. Naruto was standing at the bedside, eyes darting from him to the window, sweater from yesterday still hiding his frail body. Draped over his left arm was a white towel, which he shoved at him. Please, take a shower, the boy said, and moved quickly out of the way as Sasuke slid from the bed. He frowned at Naruto as he took the towel, unsure if the other kid was insulting his hygiene. Before he could open his mouth, the timid kid was already exiting the book-cluttered room with the airs of someone with errands to run. Sasuke followed, rubbing his nose miserably at the cleanser fumes, and watched as Naruto returned from the kitchen with a bucket and rag. He glanced red-rimmed eyes at Sasuke before muttering again, "Please take a shower." "What? I don't stink," Sasuke retorted, face going red with embarrassment. He even sniffed his armpits quickly, and could only smell the faint scent of laundry detergent from a previous wash. He glared at his host and watched as a look of pain passed over the pallid face. "No, I have to clean," Naruto rasped in his small voice, lips trembling and eyes watering. "I have to clean more now." He nudged Sasuke with a thin finger towards the bathroom. Sasuke scowled but entered, not wanting to see the boy cry again, because it reminded him of last night, when he too had been showing that bout of weakness. He glanced around the bathroom, grimacing at the gleaming surfaces and the now very familiar chemical smell. There wasn't anything on the sink counter, but opening the mirror cabinet revealed shampoo and soaps. He proceeded to shower, relaxing when the warm water hit his chilled skin. The apartment was cold. He realized he hadn't felt warmth much when he slept last night except when he was deep in the blanket. He couldn't believe he had stayed the night at some weird kid's house. He'd never been the type to befriend some random kid, or go to his house for that matter. His father had always stressed caution around anyone that wasn't an Uchiha, especially after their distant cousin Hyuga Hinata had almost been kidnapped. He didn't think he had much to worry about in the kidnapping department anymore. The Uchiha line was all but dead. Sasuke shut off the water and stared silently as the water drained down into the pipes. He rubbed his face and stepped out of the tub. "Hate me. Itachi ruined everything. Hate me. His whole clan gone. Hate me." Sasuke grit his teeth and clenched his fists, felt hot rage run through his small body. He hated him. He grabbed the towel and wiped the water from his body, face red with anger. He glanced around, instantly feeling stupid when he realized he hadn't brought any clean clothes. He glanced around for his pants and balked when they were not within sight. He opened the door and sauntered into the hallway, spying Naruto wiping the walls down with a rag, surrounded by bottles of chemical cleansers. He was wiping away at the same spot on the wall, the same rhythmic stroke over an area that seemed devoid of dirt. "Hey Naruto," the blonde jumped and blinked up at him owlishly from across the room. "What did you do with my clothes?" He felt a chill when he realized that he hadn't heard Naruto enter when he was showering. Naruto stopped wiping the wall and gave a weak shrug. "They're in the hamper washing." His eyelids gave a strange flutter. "They have to be washed." "Well, what am I going to wear?" Naruto just returned to wiping the wall the same spot. Sasuke threw his hands up in the air with a huff and returned to Naruto's bedroom, wrapped in the towel, and eyed the books that lined the walls. Most of them were about things, plants, animals, buildings. He pulled one up that was on ancient literature, whatever that was. Sasuke placed the book back on its pile when his eye caught a flashy blue book, and upon picking it up, saw that it was on infamous shinobi. He blinked at the gold-inked words on the cover and thought back on his class at the academy. When was the last time he had been there? He had been at the top of his class, hopefully to be as strong as his brother. He gripped the book. He supposed he was way behind now. 2 months of inactivity most likely had made him weak. Sasuke pursed his lips and concluded that he would return to the academy as soon as possible. He stood up, brushing damp hair from his face, and headed back into the living room, his stomach grumbling in its emptiness. He hadn't eaten much yesterday except for a bowl of cereal in the morning, and that had barely gone down well. He glanced at Naruto, who was wiping the small table with the lamp, the strong smell of the cleanser making his eyes water. Sasuke moved into the spotless kitchen, tightened his towel, and peeked into the cupboard. It was empty. He glanced back at Naruto, who had moved on to brushing the couch with the cloth, which was weird because wasn't that going to make the couch wet? His stomach grumbled again, and he braved looking into the refrigerator. Not only was it empty, but it also wasn't on. Sasuke gave a small sigh, which he was sure was unbecoming of an Uchiha, and moved into the living room. Naruto had left the couch and was examining the carpet, no doubt looking for a reason to clean it too. Sasuke moved over to the couch and touched it. It was cool to the touch, but it wasn't wet as he imagined it might be. He slumped down and ignored the ache in his belly, sure that at some point his host would remember it. It was poor manners to ask for food, his mother had said so, and he would just have to wait for it to be offered, though he couldn't imagine what Naruto would give him, since the house was empty. A buzzer went off, catching Naruto's unwavering attention, and the blonde disappeared into the small pantry to return with Sasuke's clothing. Grateful that he could at least put something on, Sasuke removed the towel from his waist and donned his fresh scented blue shirt and black pants. Naruto, on the other hand, headed for the bathroom, and moments later the run of water told the hungry Uchiha that the boy was taking a shower. Sasuke returned to the book-cluttered room and sat on the edge of the bed, gazing at the newspapered window. He would go back to the academy and learn everything. He would be the best, better than the others, better than Itachi. He sat there in silent thought until the door opened, and Naruto slipped into the room, eyes darting towards him from under the hood, that he smoothed down, before sitting in his pillowed corner. Sasuke's stomach took the moment to give a rather angry declaration, loud enough that he turned crimson, and Naruto blinked up at him. Sasuke looked away feeling embarrassed, then looked back at the blonde, examining the empty expression, the flutter of his eyelids. Naruto crawled forward and slipped his hand under the bed, retrieving a chocolate bar. He held it out to Sasuke, who blushed and took the candy bar. As he hungrily ate the bar, thinking that his mother would have a heart attack if she had seen him eat that for breakfast, wondered if this was all that the blonde ate. He peered at the blonde, at the hollows in his cheeks, the puffy red-rimmed eyes, the thin fingers that clutched the book he was reading. He was really skinny, and he looked so weak he wondered how the boy mustered any energy to clean. If Itachi had seen him, Sasuke shuddered at the thought and glanced around the room for a trash can to throw his empty wrapper. Though he no longer felt hunger pangs, he wanted a real meal, a well-rounded one for a growing ninja. Leaving the room, he headed into the kitchen and saw a small bin in a corner. Peering inside, a whiff of chocolate blew his way and he spied several wrappers at the bottom, along with what looked like a half-eaten sandwich. Sasuke tossed the wrapper inside, then headed for the door, donning on his sandals, which to his horror, were damp. Lifting his sandal to his face, Sasuke sniffed it and jerked his head away. The familiar scent of foot sweat had been replaced by detergent, and he sent an incredulous look at Naruto's bedroom door before putting it on his feet and unlocking the door. As he opened the door, he squinted into the mid-morning light, grimacing at the blaring sun, and realizing just how gloomy the spotless apartment was. Closing the door behind him, Sasuke headed down the stairwell, glancing at the other apartments, noticing that the whole floor was eerily silent. But as he headed down to the first floor, he saw people moving about inside of the rooms. Moving out into the village, he glared at the happy faces of the civilians, their faces so relaxed and carefree. Sasuke stopped by a stall and had rice and fish, drowning away the sweetness of the chocolate that sat unhappily in his stomach. When he was finished, he headed for the academy, aware that by the time he arrived it would be lunch. Entering the academy, he watched as the other children ate their lunches, talking, laughing, or tossing kunai at trees, perfectly comfortable, perfectly safe. Sasuke stuffed his hands in his pockets and headed for the rooftop, knowing that very few of the students bothered to go there. "Hey Sasuke-kun!" One girl called, and he glared at her. "Where have you been, Uchiha-san?" Some boys called. "I heard he dropped out," one kid whispered, and Sasuke's shoulders tensed at the remark. Like hell he would. His pace quickened until he was at the roof, where he sat leaning against the fence and took a deep breath through his nostrils. An Uchiha dropped out of anything? Not likely. He would show them he may be one of the last, but he would be the best. Sasuke remained on the roof until lunch was over, then he headed for his class. Upon entering, the other students stared, as if he were reported dead or something. Sasuke stared coldly back, until their nosy eyes looked away, except for Iruka-sensei, whose warm eyes were filled with concern and relief. "Sasuke," the man said with his calm voice unless he was shouting. "It's good to see you back. You've missed much, but I'm sure you'll catch up quickly." Yes, he would. Sasuke nodded towards the man, thankful that he wasn't making a big deal of it, and sat down in the second row, as far away from the weird pink-haired girl who kept staring at him on and off. Mizuki-sensei, an assistant of Iruka-sensei, handed him a small stack of back assignments, and he got to work on them quickly enough, tuning out the sound of the other students. He hated this place. Naruto stripped the bed, pulling the blanket and sheets from the mattress and piling them on the carpet. Sasuke had slept in this bed, and the thought of it remaining unwashed caused his skin to tingle uncomfortably. The dark-haired boy had left after he had eaten, and Naruto hoped he would not return. He must, we need him, he will show us the way. Naruto cringed at the excited voices in his head, the ones who tormented him along with the villagers. Naruto dragged the linen to the hamper, while his eyes clouded with tears. Why do we need him? He's just going to hurt us, I know he will. He's a villager. What can he show us beyond pain? Power. Naruto screeched and stumbled, crashing into the dryer, bashing his head, and dropped to his bony knees. Pain burst through his skull, and he curled up in a ball as he felt blood ooze from the wound on his forehead. He prayed it would heal slowly. Sasuke exited the ninja academy, mood sour and bitterness running through his mouth as he headed into the street. By the end of the day, the whole academy was privy to his tragedy, a lot of OHS and that Uchiha-s, accompanied by round eyes and barely veiled whispers. All of it left him angry and unlikely to strike up a conversation with all the nosy students, who no doubt wanted to know what it was like to lose everything one loved. He wandered around Konoha, trying to avoid the inevitable, which was going back to the Uchiha compound, back to death. He stood next to street vendors and hawkers, biting his fingernails and remembering that it was a bad habit, only to do it again 5 minutes later as he watched villagers move on with their perfectly normal lives. He wondered what Naruto was doing, and could only imagine that he was cleaning, or sitting in that corner surrounded by books. Did Naruto get lonely? Sasuke stifled a sigh and headed back to the compound, even though he had sworn that he wouldn't return there. It wasn't like he had a place to go unless he wanted to spend it in an orphanage, which he had heard was the last place one wanted to go. Arriving at the gates, his eyes darted to all the vacant houses, many with signs that death had come way too quickly, food still in bowls, laundry hanging on the lines. He entered the compound with hunched shoulders and a pale face, quickly heading toward the main house, which never used to seem so big until now. Arriving at his home, he took a deep breath and was appalled by the dust that hung in the air. He eyed his surroundings, taking in the dust that sat comfortably on the tabletops, and floated in the last rays of light produced by the fading sun. He shut the blinds quickly and headed up the stairs to his room, thinking that compared to Naruto's place, his own would seem like a dirt trap. When in his room, he dug all the jutsu scrolls that his father had given to him, most of them fire-based, and began to practice the hand movements and the build-up of chakra. Twice during the hour of practice he had jumped at the creaking of the house, or a bird bursting from the brush outside his window. He even shut the curtains in his room and wondered why he even bothered. No one would come here. Another hour later, and he had ceased to study the jutsu. Instead he wandered the house, ran a rag over the kitchen counter, and for the 5th time wondered what Naruto was doing. Was he still reading? Eating? No, he doubted that Naruto would be eating. Sasuke opened the kitchen cabinets and eyed all the packaged foods that sat uneaten in them, countless meals that his mother would never make again. He should share them. The bed had long since been remade, his wounds had been logged into the small brown leather book that he kept next to his pillow, and his apartment was decontaminated. All was as painless as he could possibly get it, except that he was so weak, he could not stand anymore. Naruto stayed on hands and knees, eyes clouded by tears, body feeling flushed, and yet cold at the same time. There was a racket in his head, bouncing around his skull, many voices that sniped and collided, shouted and whispered such a cacophony of noise and pain that he wanted to curl up in a ball and attempt to sleep it away. But he wasn't in his room, and it wasn't safe out here. He could feel them trying to peek through the windows, raging at the newspaper that blocked their prying eyes, wanting to see if there was a monster still in here. Naruto turned and crawled towards the kitchen. He needed nourishment, water, and maybe a candy bar for the sugar and caffeine. They wanted something more, most likely meat, but he didn't like it when meat was accompanied by bloody scenes, animals, people flesh tearing, blood dripping, and screams of terror and pain. There were monsters in his head, and they wanted blood. He gripped the sink and pulled his frail body up, leaned over the sink and turned on the faucet, drinking greedily, until his stomach stretched and ached. With the water in his belly, he could walk to his room, where it was safe, and as he slowly made his way to the hallway, someone knocked on his door. Naruto froze, the voices paused, and silence reigned in the apartment. Naruto's eyes trained on the bottom of the door, where the outside hall light seeped in and what looked like the shadows of feet hovered. It wasn't the Hokage, he knew, since the man had been there yesterday, and the mere thought of a villager trying to come in made sweat appear on his pallid face. There was another knock on the door, but it was less assertive, and was accompanied by an uncertain, "Naruto." It was Uchiha Sasuke. Naruto swallowed painfully. What did he want? Why was he back? Images of villagers standing behind the black-haired boy almost sent him into a blind panic if not for the insistent voices chanting, "Let him in, let him in, let him in, let him in." But he had just cleaned everything. Tears of defeat clouded his eyes and trailed hotly down his face as he went slowly to the door, pulling his hood up to cover as much as he could before he unlocked and opened the door a crack to peer out at the other kid. Sasuke stood outside the door, face flushed and eyes alternating between peering at him and looking elsewhere. There was a large blue pack strapped to his back, and it seemed jammed full of outside things that he just knew he wouldn't like in his home. Let him in, let him in, let him in, let him in, let him in. Naruto moved back a foot and opened the door as wide as he would allow, hoping that the large pack strapped to Sasuke's back wouldn't rub so hard on the door as the boy squeezed himself through. Sasuke's nose wrinkled as he placed the pack gently against the wall, and removed his sandals. He flexed his shoulders and then managed what may have been an attempt at a smile as Naruto quickly shut and locked the door, allowing his eyes to sweep the area, sure he was going to catch one of the villagers watching him from the shadows. He did not see anyone, and this only made him more apprehensive, that they were so good at hiding and watching him. Naruto quickly retreated to his room, feeling ill and not wanting to eat any longer. This return visit reeked of routine, and no doubt Uchiha Sasuke would be returning every day, contaminating his apartment daily. Naruto sat in his corner, pulling his hood down over his tear-stained cheeks, imagining days filled with constant cleansing, running over things twice no 3 times in order to remove the filth that Sasuke would bring in. His door opened and Sasuke slipped in, holding an indigo blanket and matching pillow. Naruto pulled himself up and quickly snatched the blanket and pillow from the startled boy. Is this all you brought?" he demanded weakly, and the Uchiha hesitated before pursing his lips and shaking his head. Naruto turned and quickly headed down the hallway, stopping before the large travel pack. Sasuke sighed and opened the zipper, pulling out articles of clothing, another pair of sandals, several large parchments of paper that he recognized as ninja jutsu scrolls, and at the bottom, food. Naruto gathered all the cloth and headed for the hamper, ignoring the sigh that followed him. There wasn't anything he could do about the scrolls, but he would run a disinfectant wipe over all the food that were wrapped in plastic, boxes, or containers. The voices whispered through his head in contentment, and the headache subsided to the point where the knot at his shoulders actually relaxed. Naruto took a deep breath as he dumped all the clothing into the washing machine and actually felt a wave of relaxation flow through him. He moved into the living and peered at his returned guest, and watched in chagrin as the other boy pulled the refrigerator forward and plugged it in. His kitchen cabinets were open, and to his horrified fascination, it seemed that Sasuke was trying to fill them up with food. Naruto's shoulders sagged as misery returned. He would have to go over the kitchen later on tonight. Sasuke pushed the refrigerator back and turned toward him. "Are you hungry?" he asked, dark eyes focused intently on his face. Naruto blinked and shuddered, smoothing down his hood and quickly retreated to his room. He sat in his corner and covered his face with his pale hands. The headache was returning, and Sasuke was ruining his carefully calculated routines with a cruel efficiency that reeked of villainy. 10 minutes later Sasuke entered the room, reeking of some kind of food, foreign to him and permeating his apartment. Sasuke sat on the bed, an armful with scrolls that he idly went through before glancing at him every once in a while. He did not like that stare. It was often the look the Hokage donned before he was about to do something to him. "You really should eat, you know," Sasuke said in what seemed like a weak attempt at being authoritative. A funny expression came over his face, a paling of the features before it went blank. "You're too weak. How do you expect to protect yourself?" Naruto's heart began to pound, his headache increasing. Protect himself? That was why he stayed here most of the time, for protection. Did Sasuke know that someone was going to hurt him? He wanted to hide from Sasuke, who didn't make him feel safe. Sasuke was fingering the scrolls, black eyes still focused on him. "You should join the Ninja Academy, Naruto, and become a shinobi, like me," so that he once again cut himself off with a thinning of the lips, but Naruto didn't notice, now that the blood that was pounding in his head angrily now drained from it, leaving him dizzy. Join the academy. Become a shinobi? That would mean going outside, talking to the villagers, touching them. He was ill, just at the thought, even as Sasuke seemed to nod to himself with resolve. It'll be easy to get you signed up, he was saying to himself, they accept just about anybody, and I'll train with you. He was glaring angrily at the scrolls now, fingers gripping the paper. He'll never be able to take. Naruto curled up in a ball and covered his ears, their laughter echoing throughout the reaches of his mind. His eyes rolled up into his head as darkness dragged him under. He knew that it wouldn't be long before he was jolted awake by some scene of pain, blood, and death. It upset him, the idea of waking up to Sasuke's black eyes. Chapter 3. That morning, Sasuke woke to a knock on the front door, and a weak gasp from his companion. Sasuke pulled his blanket from over his head and blinked blearily at Naruto, who was curled up in his blanket in the corner, dull blue eyes wide with terror. Who could that be? There was another knock, then what sounded like a key in the door lock. Alarm raced through him, and he glanced once again at Naruto, whose pale face was also beginning to look a sickly green. Get under the bed, Sasuke hissed, then grabbed the kunai he had placed under the pillow as Naruto crawled quickly and obediently under the bed. Sasuke's heart was pounding in his ears, and he too felt like throwing up. It was Itachi. He knew it was his brother coming to finish him and anyone with him off. He moved to the door and slowly turned the handle, trying to silence his breath. He peeked through the crack and saw two figures standing in the doorway. Neither looked like Itachi. Sasuke slipped through the bedroom door and stared incredulously at the Hokage himself, standing next to what looked like an assistant. What was the Hokage doing here? The old man smiled in relief. Ah, Sasuke. What a surprise to see you here. Naruto usually doesn't like people in his home. I am the only one that's managed so far. Sasuke was dumbfounded. The Hokage visited Naruto personally. Sasuke managed to gather his wits about himself, calling back to the bedroom door, it's okay. It's just Hokage-sama. He saw Naruto's head peek out from under the bed, but disappeared back under in a flash. Sasuke sighed and turned back to the Hokage, warily eyeing him and the man who was standing next to him, looking around the apartment with curious eyes. He stuffed his hands in his pajama pockets and waited impatiently for the Hokage to state why he was here. Is Naruto all right? The old man asked, and Sasuke shrugged, unsure how he was supposed to answer that. Yes, he fine. Or no, he's crazy? The Hokage smiled at his shrug and sat down on the black couch. The man with him had his nose wrinkled, obviously in response to the sharp chemical cleanser in the air. I'm glad you're with him, Sasuke. Naruto has been alone since he was a toddler, and he doesn't have any friends. Sasuke leaned against a wall and glanced at the bedroom door. Naruto had been alone since he was a baby? No wonder he was scared of everyone. Sasuke crossed his arms and stared at the elder ninja. The Hokage could get Naruto enrolled in the academy quickly and efficiently. I think, he started cautiously, and the Sandaimyo's brows rose in anticipation. That Naruto should come to the ninja academy with me so that he'll be safer. The Hokage's dark brown eyes studied him for a moment, then darted toward the bedroom door, which was cracked open a bit. The assistant looked startled at his proposition, and kept darting nervous glances about the apartment. Then the Hokage spoke. It's a splendid idea. Sasuke, Naruto needs to get out and interact with other human beings, and I would love to enroll him, but I fear that getting him to go would be almost impossible. Sasuke uncrossed his arms and smirked. I can get him to do it. The Hokage stared speculatively at the youth before getting to his feet. All right, Sasuke, I'll have him enrolled today and he can start Monday. However, I'm putting you in charge of his welfare until he is capable of making rational decisions himself. Do you understand? At his nod, the Sandaime sighed. I'm sure right now you don't understand, but you will soon comprehend the enormity of your new responsibilities. The Hokage moved to the bedroom door and peered in, spying a lock of Naruto's hair under the bed. I know you'll be angry with this decision, Naruto, but it's for your own good. You'll thank me later, I imagine. There was no reply from under the bed. The Hokage sighed and moved from the doorway and patted Sasuke's head good-naturedly as he and the assistant headed for the door. Sasuke watched as they left, the assistant sending a last nervous look about the small complex. He understood why the man might be startled by the cleanliness of the place, but there really was no reason for him to look so spooked. The door clicked shut, and the outside world left. Sasuke took a deep breath and felt a surge of excitement, something he hadn't felt since the massacre. He turned back to the room and spied Naruto crawling out from under the bed, shaking like a leaf, thin fingers gripping the carpet as he moved, not unlike an old man. His face was scrunched in pain as he rose unsteadily to his feet, and when his miserable eyes opened, they sent despairing looks his way. Sasuke moved into the room and dug into his pack, pulling out toiletries so that he could get cleaned up, selecting his favorite blue high-collared shirt and white shorts as he headed into the bathroom. Naruto had moved into the kitchen, and Sasuke saw a glimpse of the cleaning bucket. He grimaced and brushed his teeth, thinking on all the things he had to do, and feeling anticipation move through him. Today was Saturday, so he had today and tomorrow to get Naruto up to speed and perhaps assess his skills at chakra manipulation if he had any at all. The thought gave him pause as he turned on the shower and stepped in. Sasuke shrugged and lathered his hair with shampoo. No worries, they were at the part in the academy where they were just getting in touch with their chakras, so Naruto wouldn't be behind. The door opened suddenly and in strode Naruto, rag and bucket in his hands. "Hey!" Sasuke snapped incredulously as he realized that Naruto was going to clean the bathroom as he showered, judging by how he placed the bucket down on the tiled floor and began to spray the sink counter with disinfectant. "Hey! You can't do that while I'm in here," he stated calmly, but the blonde only pulled his hood down and ignored him, rubbing the rag methodically over the counters. Sasuke sighed and continued his business, trying to ignore the almost silent sounds that Naruto was making. When he was finished, he found that Naruto was waiting patiently by the bathroom door, and his clothing had been folded neatly on the counter, even his pajamas. He wrapped a towel around his waist and scowled at the other boy, grabbing his clothes and headed into the bedroom. Naruto quickly shut the bathroom door behind him. After drying and dressing, he headed for the small kitchen, ignoring the ache of fresh disinfectant, and opened the refrigerator, which hummed happily, in his opinion probably glad it was actually being used, for once. He'd brought eggs over, and he remembered seeing his mother make an omelette before, so he pulled them out and dug into the cupboards, relieved to see that though Naruto didn't have food, he at least had the utensils needed to make and eat food. Which was weird. Naruto rocked silently under the spray of the water, eyes focused on the tiled wall before him, face frozen in horror. Sasuke was really going to try and make him into a ninja. He pulled at his wet locks, increasing his pounding headache as he cried silently, trying to muffle the occasional sobs that broke free. Why was Sasuke doing this to him? He hadn't been mean to him, he had let him sleep in his bed, and had given him his last candy bar. But he should have known better. No matter what he did, the villagers were going to get him. The moment he steps out, they would hatch plans to kill him, maybe during training or during a mission, or on his way home. There were 1,000,001 ways to die, and he knew they would pick the worst way to off him, something slow and painful. Naruto shuddered and bit his fingers to muffle a wail. Maybe he should just kill himself now and save himself further pain. Before he could think further on the idea, they roared at him, causing him to cry out and fall over from his crouch. He curled up in a ball and keened in pain, covering his ears against the sound of the water hitting the bathtub floor. He felt warm blood flood through his nostrils and knew that they had given him a nosebleed. He should have known better than to think longingly on his own demise. He outwaited the pain until it was a dull throb and the voices were down to annoyed murmurs, before he washed the blood from his face and shut the shower off. He wiped down the bathroom one last time before he was mildly satisfied that it was clean, then dried himself and put on black pants and another gray hoodie, and as he exited the bathroom was not assaulted by the comforting scent of disinfectant but a foreign scent. He stepped into the living room fearfully and stared at the kitchen where his cruel guest had not only made a bit of a mess, but seemed to just finish making a meal. There were eggshells on the countertops and crumbs of bread around the toaster that he had never used. Sasuke was standing at the small table, 2 plates with what looked like 2 pieces of bread with cooked egg slapped in between them. Sasuke sat grumpily at one end, then looked at him expectantly. "Well, come on, I didn't make this so you could stare at it." Naruto's eyes darted to the covered windows and flinched, shaking his head and headed back into the bedroom, where it was safe. He wasn't in the least hungry right now, though he knew that he should at least find a candy bar to eat, but he had given the last to Sasuke. Naruto returned to his room and pulled the sheets off of the bed, then dug into the bag and pulled out all of Sasuke's clothes, piling them up on top of the sheets. "What are you doing?" Sasuke demanded behind him, and Naruto jumped in startlement, turning to see that the dark-haired boy had brought the plates of food into the room. "Those are clean," the boy's lips pursed as he stared at the bundle of clothing. Not by his standards they weren't. He'd only washed them once, and they needed a second washing before he could feel decent about them. Sasuke had brought them from the outside world, the filthy world. Naruto moved to gather all the fabric into his arms, but Sasuke took a very threatening step forward, and Naruto backed up, dread coursing through him. No doubt, Sasuke was going to beat him up now. He smoothed his hood down over his face and tensed his shoulders, jumping in fright as the plate with the egg sandwich appeared. He jerked his head away and stared tearfully at his cruel guest, who had a very stern look on his face. "Let's make a deal," the boy said flatly. "I'll let you clean my already clean clothes, but only after you eat this." He'd backed Naruto up against the wall, the pile of sheets and clothes now behind him and far out of Naruto's reach. Naruto glanced down at the plate that was patiently held in front of him, and grimaced, the smell making him feel ill. He really didn't want to eat this. What if Sasuke had poisoned it? Despite his reluctance, he took hold of the plate and slid along the wall until he was at his corner again and sat down on his pillow, while Sasuke sat on the stripped bed and began to take big bites of his egg sandwich. Naruto stared sickly at him from under the fringe of his gray hood before picking a piece off of the sandwich and placing it in his mouth. As he chewed, he marveled at the burst of flavor, startled at the texture, and ignored the look of satisfaction Sasuke sent his way. It was when he had less than half the sandwich in his stomach that he remembered why he didn't like to eat food with so much substance. His stretched stomach seized, and he was jerked forward onto his hands and knees, holding back the heaves that racked his ribs with pain. Through the blur of tears he could see Sasuke's feet next to him, and wanted to crawl away from his cruel guest. Instead he took deep breaths and forced the nausea down until his stomach only ached with the fullness of the egg sandwich, and he pushed the plate away from him as he sat back. His guest was standing over him, glaring at the barely eaten sandwich before giving a small sigh and removing it from his sight. Naruto sighed in relief and slumped on his pillow, feeling a bit better and surprisingly strong enough to redo the kitchen that Sasuke had ruined with his messes. However, when Sasuke returned to the room, there was an intense look of determination on his face. He sat down on the bed and stared intently at him, and he smoothed down his hood in avoidance. He didn't like it when people looked at him. Looking meant thinking, and thinking meant pain for him, that is. "What do you know about chakra?" Naruto looked at him weakly and then glanced at his wall of books, all of which he had read before more than once. "Chakra is the resulting form when two or more energies are mixed together," he whispered as he crawled across the room and pulled out a pale blue book from one of the piles. "These two energies being physical energy and spiritual energy." He glanced at his guest to see that the other was pleased with his answer. "Mixing these two energies together is called chakra molding, which means to extract dash." Sasuke cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Good, at least you know what chakra is. You won't have trouble in class." Naruto paled at the idea as he pushed the book along the carpet toward Sasuke, who leaned down and picked it up, appraising it carefully. "We'll have to start today with kunai tossing, and maybe some taijutsu that I know dash." Naruto shook his head vehemently at Sasuke's words, feeling terror course through him. "I'm not going outside, not during the day." He all but wheezed, and his cruel guest glared at him in response. "Oh yes you are. We're going out today, even if I have to drag you out of this apartment." He stood up abruptly from the bed and dug into his blue pack, and to Naruto's horror, he pulled out several kunai and holsters. Naruto gasped in terror and huddled into the corner, feeling tears leak out of his eyes. His guest was going to hurt him now, just as he knew any villager would, and he had been a fool to allow anyone into his sanctuary. There was a clutter of gleeful laughter in his head, and it hurt his feelings that they found his encroaching pain amusing. "Come on," his cruel guest approached him quickly and grabbed his arm. He tried to pull away, but the other was clearly stronger, and he hung his head as he resigned himself to the oncoming pain. But it seemed that it wasn't truly Sasuke's plan to hurt him, or so it seemed as he was pulled out of the room and toward the door. He dug his bare feet into the carpet, eyes darting to the windows in terror. "We can't go out," he cried, but the cruel guest ignored him, grabbing both their sandals and managed to put his on while holding onto him. "It's not safe," he gasped. "They'll kill me, they'll kill me." He was beginning to hyperventilate. Sasuke was staring at him, a frown marring his pale skin. "Who's going to kill you?" "Them," Naruto wheezed, eyes darting to the window. He could feel them watching him already, behind the newspaper, waiting for him to come out. Sasuke shook his head, rolled his eyes, and shoved a sandal onto Naruto's foot. "No one's going to kill you," he stated in exasperation. "I'll protect you." Naruto slumped to the carpet and stared dreadfully up at his captor. He would protect him? He stared weakly as Sasuke put the other sandal on his foot and pulled him to his feet. "Where's your key?" Naruto stared. "You know, to the door? So we can get back inside." His guest was looking annoyed again. "You do have an apartment key, right? I mean, the Hokage has one, so you should have the original, and I saw you use it." Naruto dug into his pocket and produced the key, and watched in sick apprehension as Sasuke opened the door. Light from the sun flooded into the apartment, and he covered his face and pulled the hood down, letting his bangs and a few stray locks of hair cover his face. Then he was pulled out, unprotected, into the world, with only a boy he met 2 days ago's word that he would protect him. Sasuke rolled his eyes as they headed for the training grounds where they could practice throwing kunai, exasperated by Naruto's weird behavior. The way he was acting, it was as if he expected someone to jump out and kill him. With all the trouble it had taken to get Naruto out of the apartment, now that he was out, he was walking so close to Sasuke that it was a wonder they didn't trip over each other. Sasuke glanced at his companion to see that he was smoothing down that stupid hood, head down and eyes darting at everything, fearful and shaky. Sasuke glanced at the villagers they passed, none of them seemed to notice him, and he rolled his eyes again. If anything, they were staring at him, whispering to one another and giving him piteous looks, no doubt talking about the massacre. Sasuke glared ahead, he didn't need their pity nor wanted it. By the time they had arrived at the training sites, Naruto was so white he could see the veins on his neck. "See," he snapped. "We've been out here for more than 30 minutes and no one has tried to kill you." Naruto's eyes did that weird flutter and he headed for a tree, no doubt to hide in, but Sasuke grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back. "Nuh-uh," he pointed to a tree not far from them that had a bullseye carved into it. "We're going to practice kunai throwing. Let me show you how." Surprisingly, though he still jumped at just about every sound, Naruto was a bit of a natural at kunai tossing. Not that he had hit anywhere near the bullseye, but he managed to hit the tree. Most of the kids at the academy had only hit the dirt for the first few weeks, so it was interesting to see that Naruto was able to hit the tree on his first try. He listened attentively when Sasuke gave him instructions, even if his eyes darted around like he was expecting someone to jump out and attack them, and he was a patient observer. Sasuke tossed kunai with him, watching as Naruto got a little better if he would only put a bit more force into his tosses so that the kunai would actually stick into the tree. He eyed Naruto. The blonde's body, from what he had seen, was so bony it was unlikely that he would be able to do much unless he ate more. 3 hours into the kunai tossing he decided that they should go to lunch, and headed for the local food stands, Naruto following close behind him. It reminded him of how he used to follow Itachi. His mind shuddered at the thought of his brother and he stopped too abruptly, causing Naruto to bump into him. Instead of backing up though, Naruto stood literally an inch from him, head down, body trembling. "Ah, Sasuke-kun," a familiar voice called, and he looked to see that he was standing in front of the rice ball stand he used to frequent before everything was destroyed. The vendor was a kind man, and his eyes were full of sympathy as he smiled down at him. "I haven't seen you in a while. Why don't you and your friend sit down and have something to eat?" He winked at him. Sasuke glanced at Naruto, who was still too close and staring at the dirt before sitting down on one of the stools. Naruto, to his horror, moved and crouched down next to his feet, hood hiding his face, hands resting on his knees. The vendor leaned over the counter and blinked curiously down at the hooded head. "He all right?" he asked as he set 4 rice balls down in front of him, two with fish in the middle, and one with red bean paste. The other was simply rice, and he picked it up and leaned down, holding it near Naruto's face. Naruto did not lift his head, but he clearly leaned away from the rice ball. "Come on. You have to eat." Naruto shook his head and Sasuke put the rice ball back, sighing in agitation as he began to eat. "I'll pack this one away for the little guy." The friendly vendor winked at him and wrapped the plain rice ball in plastic wrap. Sasuke nodded, and as he finished dug into his pocket for change, but the vendor shook his head. "This one's on the house. You take care." Again Sasuke nodded and placed the rice ball into his pocket and moved from the stool. Naruto slowly got to his feet, then quickly followed behind Sasuke, and just as he was heading back to the training grounds, Naruto made an abrupt turn towards an alley. Startled, Sasuke followed him, and watched in stunned silence as Naruto clambered up the side of a trash bin and proceeded to throw up. It was so neatly done, that he returned to Sasuke's side like nothing had happened. "Maybe we should go back," he muttered, and headed in the direction of Naruto's apartment, Naruto following at his back. "Hey Sasuke-kun!" An annoying voice called, and he purposely ignored it. It belonging to Yamanaka Ino, with that stupid pink-haired girl no doubt with her. Ino grabbed his arm, grinning at him excitedly. "Wanna go play with us?" "We're playing Desh." She cut herself off when she noticed Naruto practically glued to him. "Who's this?" Her voice was full of curiosity, and he used her moment of distraction to pull his arm away. Behind her, a shy Haruno Sakura stared at Naruto as well. "Go away," he muttered as he grabbed Naruto's bony arm and headed quickly toward Naruto's complex. Naruto seemed almost desperate to return to the apartment. By the time they arrived, the sun was at its zenith, and he unlocked the door, slightly comforted by the blast of chemical cleanser in the air. Naruto quickly headed for the bathroom, and he imagined that the other was washing out his mouth. He locked the door behind him and pulled out the rice ball. He hated how everyone was treating him, like something fragile that needed to be coddled and pitied. He glared down at the rice ball as Naruto exited the bathroom and made a beeline for the kitchen. In moments he was cleaning it again, and Sasuke felt a bit bad that he had made a mess in it after Naruto had cleaned it earlier that morning. He moved up behind Naruto, who was wiping the counters, and tried to hand the rice ball to him, but Naruto moved away. "Why won't you eat it? We're not outside anymore, if you don't like people watching you eat." Naruto placed a thin hand on his forehead, a look of pain flashing across his thin, pale features, and he looked at him. "It's probably poisoned." Sasuke stared down at the rice ball, then sighed in defeat. It wasn't poisoned, but suddenly he didn't feel like pushing the subject. Instead he returned to the living room and slumped down on the couch, staring dully up at the ceiling. The next day, it was even harder to get Naruto to leave the apartment, and he still refused to eat the rice ball. Sasuke had tried to tempt him with noodles, fish, even some snacks, but he refused, all with a look of clear distaste. Finally, when Sasuke was completely fed up, he forced Naruto to eat another egg sandwich, having failed to recreate his mother's omelets, but it all fell through quickly when less than 30 minutes afterward, Naruto vomited on the carpet, which led to the whole carpet being cleaned. In all, there was no way he would be able to train outside today. Sasuke resigned himself to planning out routines that he thought would improve Naruto's kunai tossing skill, and perhaps show him some taijutsu that he had learned. He would leave the manipulation of chakra to Iruka-sensei, being that he didn't think he would be able to explain it better than Iruka-sensei. But this whole eating thing, how was he to get Naruto to eat anything without throwing it up soon after? His mind moved to seeing Naruto's trash can littered with candy bar wrappers. He jumped up, headed for the door and put on his sandals. Naruto ate candy bars, so he'd just go buy a whole bunch then. "I'm leaving," he called out as he unlocked the door, then paused. He'd said the same thing to his mother before he had left for the academy and had returned to her mutilated body. Naruto's head peeked out from the bottom of the doorway, his eyes blearily acknowledging that he was about to leave. Locking the door behind him, he headed down to the stairs and was startled to see the Chunin from yesterday heading up toward him. "Uchiha-san," the man murmured. "I've been sent to notify you that Uzumaki has been registered at the academy, and should show up tomorrow at 8 am. Sasuke nodded and moved past him, glancing back to see that the Chunin was staring thoughtfully at their door. Sasuke rounded the corner, then stopped and peered back, watching the man until he apparently decided to leave. Why had he been staring at their door? Full of thought, Sasuke headed to the nearest store and bought a bag full of candy bars. The man at the register had stared sickly at the amount he had bought. When he returned to the apartment, it was to a thoroughly scrubbed bedroom floor and a very pale Naruto, who sat dully in the corner, red-rimmed eyes glazed over. "Here," he muttered and produced a candy bar full of chocolate and nuts, and Naruto turned his head toward him. He handed the bar to him and watched as he took it with shaky hands, examining the wrapper until he was apparently satisfied and slowly opened it. For a second, Sasuke thought he was simply being overcautious, as if it would explode if he opened it too fast, but staring at the shaky hands, it came to him that Naruto was simply too weak to be hasty. Sasuke didn't know what it was like to be weak from hunger, and he vaguely wondered why Naruto would willingly allow himself to become that way. He watched from the bed as he nibbled slowly on the candy bar, and thought that perhaps being in the academy might inspire Naruto to eat more and maybe be less afraid of everyone. So Sasuke spent the rest of the day watching Naruto clean the apartment, and his clothes including the ones he was wearing. To his chagrin, he was forced to wear a towel, and this time, when he made something to eat for dinner, he made sure that he cleaned up his messes. Naruto had snuck out of the bedroom to peer at his handiwork, and apparently deemed his cleaning skills satisfactory, for he had darted back into his room, throwing quick glances at the newspapered windows. He noticed that unlike yesterday, Naruto seemed to have a bit more energy, judging by his quicker movements and attentiveness to things around him, so the candy bars must be helpful. That night, as he readied himself for bed, he dreaded what he would have to do to get Naruto to come to the academy, but he hoped he wouldn't have to get too violent about it. Umino Iruka greeted his colleagues amiably as he entered his empty classroom, placing a stack of papers on his desk before sitting down in the seat. Today he planned to explain chakra manipulation, though he imagined all the students from the clans will have already tapped into their chakra. He smiled as Mizuki entered and sat at his desk. He had been relieved to have an assistant appointed to him. Training a class full of juvenile killers was not only trying but dangerous. He couldn't begin to count how many kunai he'd had to dodge on Friday, and was planning on something less dangerous today. The door opened, and in strolled Yamanaka Ino and Harino Sakura, both looking excited and talkative, and they were quickly followed by other students. He watched as the always rowdy Inyazuka Kiba entered, trailed by Narashikamaru, who looked half awake, and a hungry-looking Akimichi Chuji. Several other students wandered in along with Hyuga Hinata and Aburameshino, before Sasuke appeared. Iruka was instantly relieved to see him. He didn't like the idea that the grieving boy might be spending his time alone away from the other students. Though, the way those dark eyes stared ahead, it seemed that the boy was alone, whether he was around people or not. To his surprise, closely following Sasuke was a hooded child, small and apparently trying to disappear, his/her head down, with strands of yellow hair hanging over the face, so that the only thing he could tell was that the child's skin was very pale. He/she moved along behind Sasuke almost like he was cuffed to him, and before he could be startled that Sasuke wasn't mad that his personal space was being violated, he was surprised when the child sat next to him, head still bowed. Had Sasuke made a friend? He glanced around to see that all the other students were equally as curious as he, and Yamanaka and Harino leaned forward in their seats, eyes riveted on the two. Iruka got from his seat and stood in front of the two, smiling benignly down at the newcomer. "Hello. I didn't know we were receiving a new student," he greeted, and glanced down at the attendance sheet, looking for a new name. "I'm Umino Iruka." Your sen words died in his mouth as his eyes spied the name sitting comfortably next to Sasuke's, Uzumaki Naruto. His eyes lifted from the page and he stared at the hunched boy, taking in the hooded countenance, the air of misery that hovered over the small, quivering form. Sasuke was glancing at his seatmate, then looking at him, eyes suspicious, while Uzumaki continued to stare down at the desktop. "I'm you-sensei. You can call me Iruka or Umino-sensei." He quickly moved from before them and sat down at his desk, taking the rag from his back pocket and wiping his perspiring forehead. The last time he had seen the vessel of the Kyuubi, he had been a mere infant in the Hokage's arms. He remembered staring curiously down at the sleeping child and thinking that he looked nothing like a monster. After that, time moved on and he hadn't heard of the boy since hadn't really thought of him, and hadn't heard anyone speak of him. As a matter of fact, He'd probably assumed that the child had been sent elsewhere to live. And yet, here he was, obviously terrified to be there, not even looking when he had addressed him, not looking at anything but the desk. He could feel the sheer fright coming off the child, and it was clear that it was sheer will that kept him in his seat, or it was Sasuke, because as he looked now, the Uchiha leaned toward Uzumaki slightly and murmured something to him. There was no response, or movement for that matter, and Sasuke seemed only marginally satisfied with whatever the response might have been. And so he gave a short discourse on chakra, handed out worksheets, information on chakra and its uses with 40 questions attached to it, which made most of the students groan, while Mizuki took attendance and all but balked at what he imagined was Uzumaki's name, judging by the incredulous glances he was sending his way, which Iruka dearly wished he wouldn't, because Sasuke, always a keen observer, was glancing up from his worksheet every now and then, looking at both him and Mizuki, but mostly Mizuki since he was staring so hard at poor Uzumaki. Thankfully, the class settled down to silent groans of reading and to the sound of pencils moving across paper. Ino and Sakura seemed half preoccupied with work, and at staring at Sasuke and Naruto. Even his own eyes returned to the two, and he noticed that Naruto was busy writing, and at a speed that said he must know something or two about chakra or that he had read the paragraphs carefully. The former made him nervous, the latter said that he would be a good student. His eyes zeroed in on the boy's hand, and he noticed, quite oddly too, that his fingers were very bony looking, brittle actually, with pale almost translucent fingernails, and the hands had a fine tremor running through them. He couldn't tell much by the large hoodie, but the boy did seem rather small, and he wondered what kind of treatment this child got, being what he was, or more like, what he had inside of him. He glanced at Sasuke and wondered if they were friends, or if the Hokage had asked him to chaperone Naruto for the day, but that seemed unlikely, because Sasuke would glance at Naruto every few minutes, as if making sure everything was going all right with him. So it said that they must be at least associates of some kind, though he wondered for how long. 45 minutes later, the last of them had at least finished, or had given up, and he watched as Ino and Sakura got up from their seats and moved to Sasuke. "Hey Sasuke-kun. Who's your new friend?" Ino inquired loudly, and Sasuke only gave her a half shrug of his shoulders and stared down at his worksheet. Ino moved to Naruto's side, Sakura following behind her, and placed an arm on Uzumaki's shoulders. "Hey, who are?" Naruto jerked violently away from her, his head flipped up, and Iruka was able to see some of his face that wasn't concealed by hair. Hollow, pale, watery blue eyes, sunken cheekbones under stretched pallid skin. At the same time Sasuke jumped up in his seat and snarled quite viciously, "Get away from us!" Ino and Sakura jumped back, faces stunned, and the class stared at Sasuke, who glared back coldly until most of the students looked away. Kiba, Shikamaru, and Shino stared curiously at the angry Uchiha, until he sat down and laced his hands before his face, elbows on the table. Uzumaki was staring down at the table again, but he had moved even closer to Sasuke, which the dark-haired boy did not protest to, and a small bony hand came up to smooth the hoodie down to conceal his face. The boy looked like he was starving. They were released for lunch in 3 hours, to stretch their legs and fill their stomachs, or everyone except Naruto's. Though he had brought a candy bar along with his own lunch, Naruto seemed too terrified to eat. He sat next to Sasuke under a tree, sitting too close and shaking terribly. He blamed Yamanaka for this. Naruto had been doing okay, he'd even discovered that he was a genius, judging by the way he answered those questions, and wondered what clan he had come from and what had happened to them. Then Yamanaka had to come over and intrude, and now Naruto seemed even worse than before. His skin was gray, and his eyes had gone to this empty, glassy look. "Sasuke, I want to go home," Naruto rasped, lifting his head up and turned his set eyes on him. Sasuke grimaced. "There's only a few hours left, why don't you wait?" But Naruto shook his head, eyes shut tightly and tears squeezed out of them. "Please Sasuke." His voice sounded like broken glass. Sasuke sighed and dropped his half-eaten sandwich back into its wrapper and stood up. "Come on," he muttered as he headed back to the apartment, Naruto following too closely. While the children went out to lunch, he went over their sheets, annoyed by the stupid answers that Kiba gave. To the half-assed answers Shikamaru wrote just a hint of his intelligence, then nothing. Chuji's had oil marks on his while Shino's was short and to the point. Hinata's read as timid as she sounded, and Ino had apparently copied off of Sakura. Sasuke's was very good, he was of a genius clan, but Naruto's, he had to blink several times to stare incredulously at the fine-lettered print. Naruto's was a dissertation more elaborate than the paragraphs on the first paper, it had theories, examples, and most of the words he had used were multisyllabic. The voice of these answers were not of a 6-year-old but of a scholar. He stared at the empty desk where Uzumaki had sat, and wondered just for a second, who or what occupied the space in the child's head. The door opened and the children returned, and he immediately noticed that Sasuke returned alone. The boy seemed in a most sour mood, periodically glaring back at Ino and Sakura enough that both girls knew that he was angry with them. He held his tongue until class was over, then called Sasuke over to his desk. "Have a seat, Sasuke," he gestured toward the seat in front of him, and the Uchiha glared at it before deciding to sit down. "Is Naruto alright?" "He didn't return to class." Sasuke gave him a steady look, before his eyes darted away and he tried his best to give an empty face while he shrugged. "He wasn't feeling well." "I see," Iruka murmured, feeling worry course through him. "Are you and Naruto friends?" Surprisingly, Sasuke blushed and looked decidedly embarrassed before turning his face into a scowl. "Yes." Iruka hesitated then. Is he getting enough to eat?" Sasuke turned his gaze from over his shoulder to looking directly at him, eyes searching his face for what, he could only imagine. Perhaps it would be a long time before he felt he could trust anyone again. "I can't get him to eat, he won't eat, and when he does, he throws it up," Sasuke admitted grudgingly, darting wary looks at him. Iruka sat back in his chair, staring at the boy thoughtfully. "How long has he been that way?" "I dunno, maybe for years," he replied with a nonchalant shrug. "What have you been feeding him?" "Regular food." Iruka scratched his nose thoughtfully. "Try soups, regular food may be too heavy on the stomach for one that doesn't eat often, okay?" Sasuke nodded and moved to his feet, heading quickly for the door. When the room was empty but for him, he graded papers and mulled over what the Uchiha had told him. Uzumaki Naruto was either starving from neglect or starving himself through some mental instability. He couldn't imagine that the Hokage would let this happen though. He roughly check-marked Kiba's foolish answers, then realized that it was way past time for him to leave. The sun had set. He packed up, and was about to head home, when he thought of Naruto again. What was his home life like? He glanced back at the roster and searched for Naruto's address. Writing it down, he headed for Ichiraku's, getting a simple broth with small grains of rice floating in it, and headed for the Uzumaki residence. The apartment complex was decent, if a bit drab, and it seemed almost empty, not as noisy as his own apartment was. He headed for 057, and immediately caught sight of the newspapered windows. He stood before them and stared. Why were they newspapered? He knocked on the door, waiting patiently as he heard silent footsteps approach. Then the chain and bolt was released and the door cracked open, a black eye peering out at him, before the door opened fully and a blast of chemical cleanser assaulted him. Sasuke stood in the doorway, looking completely startled at his presence. "I thought I'd stop by and bring soup dash," he said by way of greeting as he invited himself in and took off his sandals, then stood there, taking the apartment in. "Whoa." Sasuke shut the door behind him and gave him a look of complete chagrin. He's not going to like this. At that moment, a hooded Naruto stepped out of the bedroom door, eyes falling on him, and that small bony face turned sickly with horror. His mouth opened, Iruka braced himself for a scream, but only a rasp came out, and he retreated back into the room. Sasuke sighed and took the bowl of soup from him. "I think he thinks you're going to kill him. He thinks everyone's going to kill him." Iruka winced at the boy, then stared about the apartment. It was cleaner than a hospital room, but with that strange sickly smell that let you know that this wasn't a happy place. "Why are there newspaper on the windows?" Sasuke glanced at the windows warily, then shrugged. There was a thump from the bedroom and both moved toward the door. Naruto was pacing the room, stepping over fallen stacks of books, breath ragged, eyes wild as he pulled at his hair. His hood had fallen, revealing long shoulder-length hair, weak and brittle looking. He stopped pacing as his eyes fell on him, and he flinched away from the accusatory fear in the boy's eyes. Naruto jerked into the corner, whimpering and muttering incoherent words under his unsteady breath, eyes trained upon him. Sasuke stepped into the room, showing Naruto the bowl of soup. It's just Iruka-sensei, Naruto. He brought you soup so you won't throw up. Naruto shook his head vigorously, pulling out large strands of his hair. Iruka took a step forward, and Naruto threw himself against the wall, eyes all but bulging from his head. Iruka stepped back, and Sasuke turned to him. He doesn't like people coming in here. He looked down at the bowl of soup. I'll give this to him tomorrow, maybe you should leave before he kills himself. Naruto had slid to the floor and curled up in the fetal position. Iruka pursed his lips and left the room, then stopped in the living room, eyes vacantly focused on the covered windows. The door shut behind him, and Sasuke moved past him and placed the bowl on the kitchen table. How long have you and Naruto been living together? He had seen several signs that Sasuke was a resident here. A couple days, Sasuke muttered, never turning to look at him. Iruka nodded and headed for the door. I'll see both of you tomorrow. He saw Sasuke nod as he shut the door behind him. He needed to see the Hokage immediately. That's it for part 1. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.